Hi, welcome to week 7 of History 358. This week and next, we're going to be focusing on the Stalin era, the 25-year period in which Joseph Stalin rules the Soviet Union as essentially the one-man dictator, head of the Communist Party, head of the Soviet state. A very influential and very important moment in the history of 20th century Russia, a very important moment in the history of the 20th century world. Um, and to set up our consideration of the Stalin era, what I want to do in this first lecture of the week is focus on the struggle for power that takes place within the party immediately following the death of Lenin in January 1924. So you have essentially a succession crisis. The faction struggles, the so-called struggles within the party, are a struggle over who will inherit the mantle of Lenin. That is to say, figuratively, who will inherit the charisma, the authority, the pride of place that Lenin had enjoyed within the party for so long. And historians and biographers who focus on this period of the so-called faction struggles of the mid-1920s often deploy these metaphors of conflict. Right? It's a faction struggle. It's a battle for supremacy within the party. And I think the very language itself gives you some sense of just how fiercely contested this struggle truly is. It's often described as a battle of personalities, and as we'll see, the lineup of Lenin's potential heirs include a number of men who have personal grudges against each other, who have a whole host of axes to grind. But as importantly, or maybe even more importantly than personality conflict, what's driving the faction struggles within the party in the mid 1920s has to do with questions of policy. Where is Soviet Russia headed? We know the final goal, first socialism, then the communist paradise on earth, but how will we build socialism? By what concrete means? By what specific policies? How quickly will we get there? How long will it take? These are the questions that are driving the faction struggles, and these are the questions that I want to focus on this morning. So let me just quickly swap over here and show you the terms for today as we consider the faction struggles of the 1920s. I've listed some of the names of the principal participants, and also this idea about personality conflicts and policy disagreements to which I've just alluded. The question is, how long will NEP last? How long will the new economic policy last? And what comes next? So as we think about the faction struggles today, think about them in the context of the new economic policy that we've been thinking about over the past week or so. And of course, not to give anything away, big spoiler alert, but Joseph Stalin, Yusuf Vissarionovich Stalin, will emerge victorious by the end of the 1920s. So how does Stalin best his rivals? How does Stalin emerge on top, victorious in these so-called faction struggles, the struggle for power within the party? Those are the questions I want to think about today in this first lecture, and that will help to set up and inform our consideration of Stalin's policies once he's in power. There's the man himself, Stalin on the right, Lenin on the left. I want to talk a little bit before we get into Stalin personally, up close and personal, as it were. I want to talk a little bit about the structure and membership of the Bolshevik Party and how that has changed in the early years of the Soviet state, how the structure and membership of the party has changed since the October Revolution. And just as an aside, I've mentioned this before, but a little factoid that bears repeating, the Bolshevik Party will officially change its name in 1918 to the Communist Party, or the Russian Communist Party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and we'll use these terms, Bolshevik and Communist, again, essentially interchangeably. So the Bolsheviks had undergone, as we've seen, this incredible, dizzying transformation. In just a few short years, they had gone from being an underground revolutionary party with its members struggling to stay one step ahead of the czarist police. They've gone from that to being the ruling party in a one-party state. And remember, a one-party state is one in which party elites hold not only the top positions of authority within the party, but also the top positions of authority within the structures of government. So a one-party state is one in which there is a distinct overlap of personnel between the party and the state. Anyone who had known the Bolsheviks in February of 1917, even October of 1917, would have found them difficult to recognize by 1921. On the eve of the February Revolution, 1917, the Bolsheviks had been an underground party. Right? Their top members were living abroad in exile. The ranks of the party were small. Its membership was quarrelsome, fractious, and divided. By 1921, with the Civil War over, with power securely in their hands, the party had changed in nearly every respect. Once in power, the party has a much larger membership. And many of the men and women who have joined the party in the months and years after the October Revolution do so for careerist reasons. To get ahead in the new system, you have to be a party member, which isn't to say that every man and woman who joined the party did so for purely cynical reasons. Far from it. Most did so because they were true believers. But the structure of the party changes as well. It's now very tightly organized. By 1921, the party is highly centralized. And as we saw a week or so ago, the economic and political policies of the party are putting it out of touch with its core constituencies: workers, poor peasants, soldiers, and sailors. Right? Witness the peasant revolts in the Volga region, in the province of Tambov. Witness the sailor mutiny at the Kronstadt naval base. The party is growing increasingly rigid as well, increasingly intolerant of divergent views from within. The 10th Party Congress, 1921, the same party Congress that had ushered in the new economic policy, NEP, also passes a resolution banning factions within the party. Why? The idea is that there can be debate on any policy up for discussion, but once the party has taken a vote and decided on a particular policy to follow, it is then the duty of every member to support that policy. There can be no sort of internal dissent within the ranks of the party. So the party is becoming more rigid. The party is becoming more highly centralized. Members and party organizations in the provinces are increasingly under the direct authority of the central party institutions headquartered in the Soviet capital, Moscow. And you have a party that looks and functions now in power very differently from how it had functioned in the sort of romantic days of underground exile before 1917. Another big difference, maybe the most obvious external change in the party, was the steep and rapid growth that we see in party membership. By March of 1921, the party had grown 400% since 1917. Official membership in the party stood at 750,000 men and women. Now, what do we mean by joining the party? How do you join the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party? Well, you don't just sign up, right? There's no sort of motor voter bill. You don't just go get a driver's license and click a box and register as a Bolshevik. To join the party, you had to go through a very rigorous screening process. You had to be vetted by special party membership committees. You had to submit letters of recommendation on your behalf from party members who could vouch for your political consciousness, who could vouch for your ideological commitment to the cause of revolution, who could vouch for your credentials. Your class origins would be scrutinized to make sure that you were truly not a class enemy in hiding. You had to submit written personal statements justifying and explaining why you wanted to join the party. You had to talk about how you had converted, essentially, to Bolshevik ideology. So this was a very difficult and a very time-consuming process. And again, the reason for this goes back all the way to 1902 and Lenin's theory of the party articulated in What Is to Be Done, right? That the party is the vanguard of the working class. Its membership ought to be tightly regulated, tightly controlled. And that's also the thinking behind the piece we read last week by Aaron Soltz on communist ethics. Soltz is the head of the Party Control Commission that periodically goes through the roles of party members and makes sure that everyone in the party adheres to, subscribes to the same level of ideological rigor and discipline. So this isn't just going off to join the Elks Club. This is a serious commitment. And the image you see before you is the membership form submitted by none other than Yuri Andropov, who will become the head of the Communist Party and Soviet state for a brief moment in the early 1980s when he succeeds Leonid Brezhnev. So joining the party, becoming first a candidate member, kind of a quasi-member, and then a full member of the Communist Party is a very all-encompassing life decision that you make. Now, as the party membership increases between 1917 and 1921, an inevitable result of that is that the proportion of quote-unquote old Bolsheviks within the party declines. And again, old Bolsheviks were defined as members who had joined the party before the October Revolution. And by 1919, only 20% of party members had joined before the October Revolution. And that proportion continues to decline in subsequent years. Well, what does that mean? I think it means something important. It means that by the time we get to the Civil War and thereafter, more than 80% of party members have an entirely different sort of formative experience. By 1921, the formative experience for 80% of party members was not the revolutionary struggle of 1917. It was not propaganda work in the factories, agitating to the workers, converting soldiers and sailors to the cause of Marxism, Leninism, organizing the October insurrection that toppled the provisional government. Um, by 1921, the formative experience for more than 80% of party members was not the revolution, but rather the Civil War, the brutal, violent, bloody conflict that had broken out following the Bolsheviks coming to power. Right? We've talked about um, the Red Terror, the use of violence, the use of coercion. Um, so that the the fact that the Civil War played such an important, formative, maybe even determinative role in the experience of party members uh, is, I think, an important point to keep in mind. The British historian Geoffrey Hosking, who's written a lot about the revolution, describes that as a change in style. What he means is that by 1921, the typical or archetypal member of the Bolshevik Party, Communist Party, is no longer a shabbily dressed, bespectacled intellectual, but a leather jacketed commissar with a pistol on his hip, like these guys on the right. So here you see Lenin, who always dressed as a member of the bourgeoisie, even after October, and sort of contrast some of the style we see here: the military tunics, um, um, the pistols on the hip, the men in on horseback in the background. So a new type emerges within the party, and the Civil War experience, I think, is key to understanding this mental shift. By 1921, most party members who have gone through the crucible of civil war, hardened by that experience, are used to solving problems by gunpoint if necessary. They're used to solving problems through the application of willpower, through the application of sheer effort, through the application of coercive, violent means. The old days when party members would sit around in Switzerland or in Italy playing chess and debating finer points of Marxist theology, those days are long gone, right? And the Civil War has really changed the spirit of the party. Recall, if you will, that Civil War slogan: there is no fortress a Bolshevik cannot storm, right? There is no obstacle that can remain in the face of a committed party member, right? Through the application of will, through the application of energy and effort, we can storm any fortress. And that will become one of the kind of mantras or slogans of the Stalin era in the 1930s and 40s. So the Stalin era will draw on the inspiration and example of the Civil War era. So I mentioned that now just to kind of plant that seed. And the willingness of Stalin and his men to deploy violence in the resolution of political problems, again, harkens back to the style of the Civil War era. The party is also becoming increasingly bureaucratized. As the party becomes bigger, as it becomes a party that has to administer a country spanning 11 time zones, the party is increasingly becoming a party of officials, a party of bureaucrats, a party that is swimming or caught up in a sea of red tape. There's paper to be pushed. And as some critics are pointing out in 1919, 1920, 21, we're becoming a party of paper pushers, not a party of proletarians. Right? Let me give you an interesting statistic that demonstrates the point. By October of 1919, 2 years after the revolution, only 11% of active party members were actually working in factories. And most of that 11% were actually factory administrators, factory foremen, factory bosses, not actual workers on the floor. And this was troubling uh, to many old Bolsheviks, right? Because it seemed to signal that the Workers' Party was becoming something different. This is a poster from 1920 encouraging working men and women to join the Communist Party. And you see this kind of mass exodus of working men and women from the city and the countryside coming together as one to line up in front of the Communist Party headquarters, flying the red flag, and sign up and join the party. They're being heckled and leered at by class enemies of various stripes. You can see this little working boy is about to punch that priest in the face. And very interesting details in the background. What's going on here? Interlopers, hidden enemies who are trying to infiltrate the party, have been detected along the way, and they're being tossed out on their butts. So you see a kulak who's tried to sneak in. His boots betray him, of course. Another class enemy who's tried to worm his way into the party. So there's this idea that men, women, young and old, veterans of the recent Civil War, peasants and industrial workers together as one, that idea of smuchka, the idea of the union of workers and peasants, coming together to join the party and administer the new Soviet state, prepare for the coming global revolution, despite the blandishments of enemies on all sides. But this party, this image, though, does gloss over conveniently the fact that the vast majority of party members by 1920-21 were not workers laboring in factories. They were not peasants toiling in the field. You have now this kind of stratum of full-time officials, paper pushers, bureaucrats, that's beginning to emerge and clog up the party. And this was a real concern for many because bureaucratization stood in the way of true party democracy. Now, it may sound cynical to think that, Lenin and Trotsky, for instance, are worried about party democracy. What does that even mean? Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik elite took very seriously this idea of party democracy. For the party to be truly representative of the interests of its core constituencies, workers, soldiers, sailors, and poor peasants, there had to be conversations between party members and these social groups. There had to be connections. There had to be real everyday interactions, or else the party would run the risk of growing further and further apart from the very people whom it intended to serve. And so Lenin, and especially Trotsky, were very, very concerned about the problem of bureaucratization. Bureaucratization was creating an artificial divide between the party and the people. And we have to bridge that divide somehow. As the party got bigger, as the party grew in size, new institutional structures had to be created so that decisions could be made in a timely fashion. Perhaps the most significant of these was formed in March of 1919. The Political Bureau, or the Politburo, was formed. And the Politburo was a nucleus, if you will, of the highest ranking, most senior members of the party. Familiar names: Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin. These are the elites, and they make up the Politburo. Here you see a photograph of the Politburo in session. Lenin is sitting right here. The Politburo meets once, twice, three, four, 5 times a week to deal with the daily workings of party business. Later that same year, 1919, the office of the Secretariat is formed. And the Secretariat is headed by the General Secretary of the Communist Party. It's the job of the Secretariat's office, the job of the General Secretary, to supervise party membership, to keep personnel files on party members, to admit new members to the party, to work with the Control Commission to expel unsuitable members of the party who don't live up to proper party norms and standards. So the Politburo and the office of the Secretariat, these bodies become increasingly more and more important by the end of the Civil War and after, and they remain so. Party congresses, party conferences, where the whole party comes together to vote, these will become increasingly less important. The actual day-to-day functioning of the party will be handled behind closed doors by these bureaucratized organizations, the command system, the nervous system of the party. So to sum up, by the end of the Civil War and the beginning of NEP, you have a party that is increasingly made up of new types of members for whom the Civil War and not the Revolution was the formative experience. You have a party that is becoming more bloated, more bureaucratized, less and less a party of workers, and more a party of officials who are making decisions behind the scenes, behind closed doors. The all-important office of General Secretary, the head of the Secretariat, is Joseph Stalin. As head of the Secretariat, as General Secretary of the Communist Party, Stalin has enormous control and influence over the party membership rolls. That is to say, it is Stalin who determines, Stalin's office, who determines who becomes a party member, who rises up through the ranks, who's promoted, who gets tossed out. So as head of the Secretariat, as General Secretary of the Communist Party, Stalin essentially controls the party. And he uses that position to outmaneuver his rivals, none of whom, ironically, wanted the job. When the job of General Secretary came open in 1918, Yakov Sverdlov had died of the global influenza epidemic. Lenin was searching for a successor. Trotsky didn't want it. He didn't want to waste his time with paperwork. Zinoviev and Kamenev didn't want it. Stalin says, I'll do it. And as General Secretary, an unglamorous but incredibly important position, Stalin is able to wield enormous power. And in fact, I would argue that the secret to Stalin's victory in the faction struggles is that he controls from this institutional base the all-important question of party membership, who's in, who's out. So let's turn to the faction struggles. As long as Lenin was alive and active, his charisma, his prestige, made him the acknowledged leader of both the party and the state. But by 1922, his health had deteriorated badly. Lenin suffered his first stroke In May of 1922, it left him partially paralyzed on his right side. He suffers a second, even more debilitating stroke in December of 1922. And after that time, Lenin spends the next 13 months until his death basically recuperating from his illness, removed from the day-to-day workings of state and party affairs. He's living at his country home outside of Moscow, uninvolved in the day-to-day maintenance of government and party politics. It was obvious to Lenin's closest comrades that his days were numbered. And the question then, of course, was who could take his place? Who would be able to lead the party and the country? No one could fully fill Lenin's shoes, but who was up for the task? There were several major figures, potential candidates, if you will, who were expected to compete for power and leadership once Lenin died. This is just an image from the late teens, early 20s, with Lenin front and center and showing a number of high-ranking Bolshevik party members around him. Trotsky, Lunacharsky, Kollontai on the bottom right, Zinoviev, and others whom we've talked about. So there was no shortage of possibilities, right? Perhaps the most compelling candidate to succeed Lenin was Leon Trotsky, a figure we've spoken of throughout the last few weeks, the People's Commissar of War, the man most frequently mentioned as Lenin's potential heir and successor. Trotsky, of course, had headed the Military Revolutionary Committee in October of 1917. He was the architect of the October insurrection that brought the Bolsheviks to power. It was Trotsky who had brokered the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, pulling Russia out of the war with Germany. It was Trotsky who had created the Red Army and inspired it to victory in the Civil War. But Trotsky had a few big strikes against him. For one, many old Bolsheviks who had been with Lenin since 1903 could not get over the fact that Trotsky had been a Menshevik up until the summer of 1917. And for more than a decade, he had been a very outspoken and fierce critic of Lenin and Lenin's policies. Trotsky had converted, if you will, from Menshevism to Bolshevism in the summer of 1917 because he saw the Bolsheviks as the only party willing and able to seize this revolutionary moment and create the revolution that we've dreamed of for so long. So he, like others, Kollontai, Lunacharsky, jumped ship in 1917, but many old Bolsheviks could not forgive Trotsky for his quote-unquote heretical past. Everyone who came across Trotsky, who interacted with Trotsky, was impressed by him. He was a brilliant man, but he was also incredibly arrogant, incredibly fierce, and that ferocity failed to win him long-lasting political allies. Lunacharsky, People's Commissar of Enlightenment, whom we spoke of a few weeks ago, referred to Trotsky's nonchalant, high and mighty way of speaking to anyone, all and sundry. He carried himself as if he were above the common man. A French communist who visited Moscow in 1921 and met with Trotsky described him as more feared than loved, if that is possible. So Trotsky has some strikes against him, his legendary arrogance, chief among them. Other possible successors included Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, who were usually mentioned together in the same political breath, more or less inseparable. Kamenev and Zinoviev had been Lenin's oldest comrades. They had stood with him at the 1903 Party Congress in London when the Russian Marxist Party split into its Bolshevik and Menshevik factions. They were with him in exile prior to 1917. Zinoviev even accompanied Lenin back to Russia on the sealed train that arrived at the Finland station in April of 1917. While Lenin lay dying, Zinoviev was head of the Petrograd city organization, which put him as the #1 party boss in the country's second biggest city, Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Zinoviev was also head of the Communist International, or the Comintern, which was the international organization of worldwide communist parties headquartered in Moscow. And this was a position of immense global prestige at a time when everyone still thought that the international global revolution was about to break out any day now. So Zinoviev was sort of the face of global revolution. Kamenev, shown here in a photograph with Lenin, Kamenev was chair of the Moscow City Soviet, and he was Lenin's #2 man, the deputy chief of the Council of People's Commissars. So between them, Kamenev and Zinoviev had impeccable party credentials. They were well respected, if not well loved, within the party. But they had a big strike against them. In October of 1917, on the very eve of the October Revolution, Kamenev and Zinoviev had gotten cold feet. And they had gone to the press and said, we ought not to strike and lead a revolution now. We ought to postpone this talk of an October revolution. The time is not yet right. And Lenin forgave them for their indecision, their cowardice, as some saw it. He forgave them, but he never completely forgave them, if you will, right? And that hesitation at a moment of critical decisiveness was always thrown back in the faces of Kamenev and Zinoviev by their rivals within the party. Zinoviev was a hard man to love. He was a great speaker, a great orator, but critics charged that there was very little substance beneath his rhetoric. Stalin once said of Zinoviev, hysteria is not a policy. There's really nothing more to Zinoviev than screeching hysterics, in other words. Trotsky, in his brilliant autobiography, My Life, describes a critical moment of the Civil War. The White armies are about to seize Petrograd. Trotsky's armored train arrives hours ahead of the Whites. Trotsky bounds into Zinoviev's headquarters to find Zinoviev sprawled out on a fainting couch, muttering, woe is me, all is lost, in a state of panic. So when the chips were down, was Zinoviev really a man on whom you could rely? He was also one of the most disliked of all the Bolsheviks, and there's some real competition for that title. The writer Maxim Gorky despised Zinoviev because Zinoviev had so cruelly consigned so many writers and intellectuals to be arrested or interred in concentration camps, deported, even shot. One prominent Italian communist described Zinoviev as the most despicable individual I have ever met, save only for Mussolini. So that's pretty pretty damning praise, if praise it be. But it gives you some sense of uh, what a divisive figure Zinoviev was. Kamenev, by all accounts, was a much gentler, a much more genial figure, but he was always sort of tainted by association with his longtime friend and comrade Zinoviev. Next in line, you have Nikolai Bukharin. Uh, Bukharin was the co-author of the ABC of Communism, which we've looked at. He was regarded as one of the brightest stars in the party, a rising star. He had a reputation, deservedly so, as a gifted writer, as a thinker, as a propagandist. He served for a time as the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Pravda, which means truth in Russian. That became one of the official newspapers of the Soviet state. Politically speaking, though, Bukharin was kind of a chameleon within the party. He flip-flopped throughout his political career until the very end, 1938, when he perishes in the Stalin-era purges. Bukharin is a flip-flopper. He's on one side of an issue, he thinks his way over to another side of the issue, and he thinks his way back to the original position he had taken. And this drives his political comrades batty. He had been a fierce opponent of peace with Germany during the negotiations leading up to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He wanted to export revolution at gunpoint. Why sign a peace with the Germans? Let's push forward and bring global revolution at gunpoint, at bayonet point, all the way to Paris and beyond. By the mid-1920s, he's backed off that position and become much more of a centrist within the party. In fact, Bukharin is the chief spokesman for a long NEP. So, as we'll see, at a time when the party is debating the duration of the new economic policy, Bukharin is the chief spokesman, if you will, the chief proponent of a long NEP, a slow and gradual process towards socialism. So Bukharin, for all his strengths, for all his virtues, and everyone who came across Bukharin loved him. Memoir literature, personal reminiscences almost unanimously suggest that Bukharin was beloved by his comrades in the party. He was witty, he was clever, he was dazzlingly intelligent, but he was easily manipulated. He was politically gullible. And Stalin will use Bukharin to help him outmaneuver his own political enemies. And then, when the time is right, Stalin will toss aside Bukharin as well. Which brings us to the last of the potential successors. Rounding out the list is Stalin. Unlike the others, Stalin is a Georgian. He's from the Caucasus in the south of the old Russian Empire, bordering on the Ottoman Empire. And we talked about the Russian Empire as a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional polity, and how the policies of the last two czars, Nicholas II and his father, Alexander III, had pushed many ethnic and national minorities to reject the official state ideology and gravitate towards a policy of revolutionary resistance. Stalin is a classic example of that. Prior to 1917, Stalin had played a relatively minor role in the party leadership. He had been on the outskirts of the party leadership. He was known to Lenin, but Lenin could never remember his name. There's a letter that Lenin writes to Zinoviev in 1906, 1907, and he says, "What's the name of that Georgian again? We've got to find some work for him. He was impressive." And Zinoviev writes back, it's like, "Oh, I know who you mean. I can't think of his name." soon everyone would know Stalin's name. Stalin played little to no role in the October Revolution itself, but when the first government is formed, the Council of People's Commissars, Stalin is named People's Commissar of Nationality Affairs because Lenin believed that it was politically expedient to have a non-Russian, Georgian, in Stalin's case, in charge of heading up the government office that would deal with issues pertaining to ethnic and national minorities. All of these figures that we're talking about, Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, these are all pseudonyms, just like Lenin is a revolutionary pseudonym. Stalin is a revolutionary alias, a revolutionary pseudonym. Stalin means man of steel. And Stalin's real name is Yosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili. He comes from far more humble origins than any of the ranking Bolsheviks. He's born in the small Georgian town of Gori in 1879. His parents had themselves been born into serfdom. And little Joseph, or Yusuf, is the only one of 4 children to survive infancy, which again gives you some sense of mortality rates among the working poor in the last decades of the old regime. Stalin's father was a cobbler by trade, and as industrialization came to the Russian Empire, skilled craftsmen and artisans found themselves out of work. Machinery had replaced them. And Stalin's father was one of many who found it difficult to make the transition from skilled laborer to factory hand. He worked in a shoe factory, but he was often out of work. He had a problem with alcohol. He was a neglectful father, and he disappeared shortly after Stalin's birth. Some say he was killed in a drunken brawl, others that he just sort of disappeared and made his way abroad. Who knows? But Stalin was raised by his mother. His mother was an illiterate washing woman. Though she was illiterate, she was incredibly tireless in her efforts to secure a good future for her beloved son. And if you're growing up in Georgia, in the south of the Russian Empire, in the 1880s, a good, secure career path would be to enter the Orthodox Church and become a priest. And this is what Stalin's mother wants for him. She wants Stalin to become a priest. And she uses whatever influence and pleading she can muster to get her beloved son admitted to the Orthodox seminary, the school where priests are trained at the age of 15. Now, if you know anything about Stalin, it's not a surprise that religion didn't exactly take with young Stalin. He was very influenced by the rituals and the style of the Orthodox service, but the actual content left him cold. And Stalin spent more time writing poetry and reading forbidden Marxist texts than he did actually studying theology and preparing to become a good priest. So he is expelled or drops out, depending on which version of the story you prefer. He's kicked out of the seminary, and he joins the local branch in Georgia, the local branch of the Russian Marxist Party. When the party splits in 1903 into its Menshevik and Bolshevik factions, Stalin signs up with the Bolsheviks, and he becomes a professional revolutionary. This is a photograph, this is a remarkable document. This is part of Stalin's police record. He's arrested in Baku, in the Caucasus, in 1910 for revolutionary activity. He spends 6 months in Tsarist prison, and you can see the police sketch, the profile, the headshot, the full-on shot with a police description of his sort of vital signs and physical characteristics, fingerprints there, and already by this time, 1910, Yusuf Zhugashvili is known and identified in the police record by his revolutionary alias of Stalin. Stalin makes a handful of short trips to Europe on party business in the years leading up to World War I, delivering money. He's robbing banks in the Caucasus to fund the party's illegal underground activities. And when monies are to be delivered, when printing presses and coded telegram machines are to be delivered, it's up to Stalin and Stalin's men to handle the transit of these instruments. So Stalin had traveled, but I think it's important to point out that he was not a worldly educated man like Trotsky or Kamenev. He was not a particularly brilliant speaker like Zinoviev. He was not a theoretician like Bukharin, nor was he as popular. He didn't play, as we've seen, a big role in the events of 1917. One contemporary observer would later describe him as a gray blur during the October Revolution. He was there, but he didn't make much of an impression. The American journalist John Reed, in his classic account of the October Revolution, 10 Days That Shook the World, does not even mention Stalin in his book. And in 1923, as late as 23, when the People's Commissar of Enlightenment, Anatoly Lunacharsky, writes a volume of biographical sketches of top Bolshevik leaders, he leaves out Stalin altogether. Not that Stalin was unimportant by 1923, far from it, but Stalin was not a personality to the extent that Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin were. Stalin was quiet. Stalin stood on the sidelines. Stalin waited in the wings. And years later, Trotsky and Trotsky's disciples would sneeringly dismiss Stalin as a nobody. Trotsky himself, who was always good for a clever turn of phrase, once described Stalin as the outstanding mediocrity of our party. And that's a clever kind of witty turn of phrase, but it's completely untrue. There was nothing mediocre about Stalin. Stalin was a brilliant politician. And while Trotsky strutted and preened on the international stage, and while Zinoviev sputtered and gave his loud, long speeches, and while Bukharin flirted with everyone in the party, Stalin was biding his time. Stalin was watching. Stalin was observing. Stalin was a master of manipulation. So the fact that Trotsky and others wrote him off as a mediocrity was a grave political miscalculation on their parts. They underestimated just how ambitious and how talented Stalin was, and just how keen and vicious his political acumen truly was. Again, a classic example is that when the job of general secretary comes available after the untimely death of Yakov Sverdlov, Trotsky is offered the position by Lenin and says, nah, I don't want it. Too much paperwork. Let Comrade Stalin do it. Stalin gratefully accepts because he knows the power that comes with that position. And he is much more of a political animal in the daily, in the sort of the day-to-day sense of the word than is Trotsky. So as general secretary, Stalin has enormous power. He doesn't flaunt it. He doesn't boast of it. But he wields it, and he wields it to his advantage. Party members owe their promotion within the ranks to Stalin's personal patronage. The end result of that is that you have a lot of mid-level party bureaucrats by the mid-1920s in this growing party bureaucracy who owe their positions, who owe their salaries, their cars, their apartments, their job security to the personal patronage of Stalin himself. In 1922 alone, just to give you one example, Stalin's committees directly appointed 10,000 provincial officials to positions in the state and party bureaucracy at all levels. 1 year alone, he's responsible for the personal promotion of 10,000 men and women, party bureaucrats, party functionaries. They owe Stalin personally, and Stalin will call in favors when the time is right. When the time is right, Stalin will ask those whom he has helped, his clients, if you will, to return the favor by voting his way at party congresses, at plenary sessions of the Central Committee. They will vote to support his platform. They will vote to demote and expel Stalin's political enemies from the party altogether. So if you're plotting to take over the party in a one-party state, do it Stalin's way. It's not flashy, it's not sexy, but it works. And we'll see more in detail just exactly how it works. But these networks of patronage, right? Client-patron relations are very important to understanding the personal dynamics of politics within the one-party state. And again, Stalin's a master at that. In March of 1923, Lenin suffers yet another stroke, his third, which deprives him of the power of speech. His political career is effectively over from this point on. This is a photograph that, of course, could never have been shown in the Soviet Union. It was not published in Russia until many, many decades later. But you see Lenin essentially deprived of the power of speech, trapped, a prisoner within his own body. Who will succeed him? 1923, Zinoviev and Kamenev approached Stalin with the idea of forming a political alliance against Trotsky. All three men despise Trotsky passionately, and they hope that they can outmaneuver him. And they hope that they can bring Stalin on board as a useful instrument, as a useful tool. Kamenev and Zinoviev thought that they were using Stalin. They were wrong. Stalin was using them. So over the course of 1923, the Troika, or trio, emerges, this sort of political alliance between Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin. And these three men, position themselves as voices of reason within the party. They position themselves as sensible moderates. They are following the path of Lenin. They are doing what Lenin would have wanted to see done, as opposed to the more extreme positions being put forward by Trotsky and his supporters. So part of the style, part of the choreography of politics during the faction struggles is to portray yourself as a faithful Leninist, as a faithful disciple of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Right? Whatever policies you pursue, whatever proposals you put forward, you couch them and frame them in a Leninist language. Right? We are doing here what Lenin himself would want to see done. And that's how Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, the members of the so-called Troika, that's how they are positioning themselves politically in 1923. And they oppose Trotsky and Trotsky's policies every step of the way. They attack Trotsky's theories on global revolution. They dredge up his Menshevik past. They use their connections with the party and state press to republish old letters from Lenin in which he scribbles angry things about what a jerk that Menshevik Trotsky is and what horrible things he's been up to. Right? They do everything possible to discredit Trotsky in the eyes of the party, in the eyes of the nation, while simultaneously, again, always playing up their own credentials as best buddies of Lenin, loyal friends, stalwart comrades who always stood with Lenin even while others, Trotsky, betrayed him. So perhaps the most notorious instance of the Troika banding together to support themselves against Trotsky and his rivals concerns a document that Lenin dictated shortly before his last stroke in May of 23. Lenin dictated a note that has since come to be known as Lenin's Testament, or Lenin's last will and testament. And it's basically a rundown of the leading candidates in the faction struggles. And Lenin basically says why each one of them is unsuited for the job. And then in a special PS postscript, Lenin fires with both barrels against Stalin. He says Stalin is too rude, Stalin is too crude, Stalin is too coarse. He does not possess what we saw last week in the readings by Aaron Saltz. He does not possess the necessary spirit of comradely relations that a party member must exhibit. And therefore, Lenin urges the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the 150 top men and women, to take a vote and demote Stalin, fire him as general secretary. What had prompted this furious, angry PS from Lenin was an exchange between Stalin and Lenin's wife, Krupskaya. Stalin, no stranger to crude language and vulgarity, had insulted Lenin's wife when she refused to allow Lenin to come and meet personally with Stalin. Lenin's too sick, he can't do it. Stalin insults her in both Georgian and in Russian, calls her all manner of unspeakable names. When word gets back to Lenin, he is shaking with rage, and he fires off that last postscript, basically saying, you cannot We cannot have a man as crude and rude as Stalin in a position of authority in the party. And I urge the comrades to do the right thing and fire. Um, Lenin wrote this in his last will and testament. His wife, Krupskaya, was prepared to make this document public, but Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, the Troika, used their influence to make sure that it was not read to the delegates at the 12th Party Congress in the spring of 1923. So they saw to it that Lenin's reservations were kept secret, that they were not shared with the rank and file party members. And here again, another classic moment. Had Trotsky been possessed of just an ounce of political skill, he would have taken the last will and testament of Lenin, published it, and used it to his own political advantage, but he didn't. Who knows what might have happened? Because had the content of Lenin's testament been made public to the party, I don't think that Stalin, even with all of the political capital he had built up over the years as general secretary, I don't think he could have survived this damning indictment from Lenin's own pen. That gives you some sense of just how influential, how authoritative Lenin's influence was. So a great what if in Russian history. Had Trotsky and Krupskaya and others used Lenin's testament more effectively, Stalin would probably never have become the undisputed head of the Communist Party and Soviet state for the next 25 years, and who knows what the course of human history might have looked like. Fun to surmise or speculate on these kinds of things, but in January of 1924, Lenin dies. And guess who leaps forward to take charge of the funeral? None other than the Troika, Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. And here you see Stalin, Zinoviev behind him. They are here at the train station to receive Lenin's body when it arrives in the capital of Moscow. And this is, again, part of a very carefully planned, carefully designed, carefully orchestrated public funerary service that will pay homage to the dearly departed leader of the Russian Revolution, while also making it very clear that Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev are the rightful heirs to our beloved Lenin. Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev accompany the body to the Hall of Trade Unions. Here you see the people filing forth. Here's the Hall of Trade Unions in Moscow. Lenin's body lies in state for several days. Thousands upon thousands of Muscovites, men and women, come to pay their last respects. Or, as one joke of the day goes, just to make sure the old bastard is really dead. January of 1924 is one of the coldest winters in living memory. So cold, in fact, that the cement sewage pipes in the city freeze, crack, and the city streets of Moscow are flooded with human waste and sewage. Patriarch Tikhon, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, says that the myrrh suits the relics. This is a sort of clever Orthodox joke, but basically the idea is that the body of a saint is suffused with a sweet-smelling odor by the power of the Holy Spirit. So Tikhon's joke is that Lenin's body lying in state smells like shit because the winter freeze has cracked the sewage pipes and sent waste and effluvia into the streets of Moscow. And the myrrh, the smell, the fragrance suits Lenin's relics. Some scenes from Lenin's funeral, the cavalry commander Semyon Budyonny and other representatives from the provincial party organizations standing next to Lenin's body as it lies in state. Again, some other photographs from the funerary services. Who's missing from all of these pictures? Well, from these couple of pictures, Trotsky. Trotsky is nowhere to be seen. This is the biggest political event of the season, right? This is the biggest act of political theater, and Trotsky's not even in the capital. He's down south in the Caucasus on sick leave, recuperating in the sun. Stalin had sent Trotsky a telegram giving him a false early date for the funeral. It says, oh, unfortunately, Comrade Trotsky, you won't be able to make the funeral, so just rest up down south, enjoy the sun, think about your health, get better, we all love you. Signed, Stalin. Right? So Trotsky is very conspicuous by his absence, if you will. And as I mentioned last week, over the objections of his widow, Krupskaya, and his surviving family members, his sisters, Lenin's body is embalmed by vote of the Politburo. It's embalmed and enshrined in this special red granite mausoleum built in a place of honor on Red Square in the very heart of the city. And here you see a photograph of Lenin's body 90 some years after his death, still on display. Again, a special team of scientists treats Lenin's body periodically with special chemical solutions, special embalming fluids. They have to change his three-piece suit so that his organs don't leak into it and other disgusting things. Now, during the Soviet period, the maintenance of Lenin's body was a task taken very seriously. Now it's something of a political albatross around the neck of the Putin regime. What are we supposed to do with Lenin? Yeltsin had suggested burying him somewhere just to get him off of Red Square. Putin has always kind of pushed the issue off to the side. One of his great successes as leader is his ability to kind of equivocate and push things away that are inconvenient. And so he's still there out of inattention, I think, more than anything else. Here you see a photograph from the Soviet period of tourists to Moscow lined up on Red Square to pay their respects to Lenin's body. This is a photograph probably from the 50s or 60s. If you go to Moscow today, as I mentioned, Lenin's body is still there. The mausoleum is still there. The crowds are long gone. But if you ever get the chance to go, I highly recommend that you do. It's just a weird, creepy, nostalgic, not to be duplicated kind of experience. Why did the Politburo vote to put Lenin's body on display in the first place? The idea, I think, and I've argued this in my book, Bodies Like Bright Stars, is that the party wanted to create an alternative miracle to the miracles claimed by the Orthodox Church. At the very same time that they are promoting scientific atheism, combating as superstition the claims of the Orthodox Church to possess some kind of supernatural power. Um, the party is presenting Lenin's body preserved from decay as a show of the party's mastery of scientific knowledge, physics, chemistry, biology, Marxism, Leninism. These are all tools in a larger toolkit designed to push us forward along the path of historical progression and improve the daily lives of toiling men and women around the globe. So there's this idea of creating an anti-miracle, an alternative to religious forms of supernatural power. But there's also this idea that as long as Lenin's body lay there in a place of honor, it was a sign to not only Soviet citizens, but citizens around the world that the ideals of the revolution survived. The great Soviet poet Mayakovsky coins a famous phrase in the days after Lenin's death. He writes, "Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live on." And here you see a later poster from the 1960s with Mayakovsky's verse. But the idea that the indomitability, the eternal nature of Lenin's teachings, of Lenin's example, would outlive his mortal body. I think this is another aspect of the thinking behind the party's decision to go over the head of Krupskaya, his widow, and embalm Lenin. Anyway, so very interesting. I think if you want to read more about that, I'm going to quickly go through some of the fallout of the faction struggles. Stalin uses his position as general secretary to reconstruct the membership of the party to serve his own ambitions. In 1924, after Lenin's death, and in honor of Lenin's memory, the party announces the so-called Lenin enrollment, or the Lenin levy. And the idea is that in memory of Lenin, who left us too soon, the party will recruit hundreds of thousands of new members, a new membership drive, from factory workers and peasants especially. And the result of the Lenin levy, or the Lenin enrollment, is that the ranks of the party swell again. About 500,000 in 1924 to 1.2 million party members by 1927. And again, of course, each one of those members is vetted, screened, and chosen by the Secretariat, of which Stalin is the head. So the rank and file, the arms and limbs of the party apparatus, is being filled by men and women who owe their positions, their jobs, their paychecks to Stalin's own personal patronage. And here you see a poster advertising the Lenin levy, this from the Ukrainian province of Kharkiv, calling upon comrade women workers to join the ranks of the Communist Party. The Troika, Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, are able to outmaneuver Trotsky again and again. Again, Trotsky is a bad schemer. He's a bad politician. He's no match for the Troika, especially Stalin. And the Troika manages to get Trotsky fired as People's Commissar of War. That is significant because it means that Trotsky loses the army as a potential base of support. Remember that the Bolsheviks always looked at their revolution from the perspective of the French Revolution. And they were afraid, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin were afraid that Trotsky could present himself, if need be, as a second Napoleon, that he could use the army where he was so popular and so powerful to lead a counter revolution. So getting Trotsky fired as Commissar of War was an important part of all of this. Well, the whole point of being for the Troika was to outmaneuver Trotsky. Once Trotsky has been marginalized and pushed to the side, Kamenev and Zinoviev realize that they have been the pawns of Stalin all this time, that Stalin has been using them to get rid of Trotsky, to push aside other rivals in the party. And so Kamenev and Zinoviev break with Stalin, they break the Troika, and they inexplicably form an alliance with their old enemy, Trotsky. They form a group or a faction within the party known as the United Opposition. Meanwhile, Stalin inches closer to Bukharin. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time charting out policy, but I do think that policy differences matter. Policy differences are important here. It's not all about personality. Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev are arguing that NEP has gone on long enough. And now is the time to do away with NEP, do away with this combo economy of mixed socialism, mixed private enterprise, and get back on the fast track of socialist construction. We also need to do away with this red tape of bureaucratism and get the workers and peasants themselves in positions to make authoritative policy decisions within the party itself, right? Let's do away with this red tape, this bureaucracy. Let's get the party and the people closer together. So Trotsky is arguing that we need to do this, and we need to do this soon. Trotsky is arguing that we need to reinvigorate the party, shake up the bureaucracy, end NEP as soon as possible, begin a rapid policy of industrialization, and we need to reinvigorate our efforts to stir up revolution abroad. Because the longer that we, the Soviet Union, has to stand alone, the worse it will be for us. Fascism is on the rise in the mid-1920s. Italy has already gone fascist. Fascist movements are emerging in Eastern Europe. The Nazi Party is forming in Germany. We need to spread revolution abroad, Trotsky says, in order to counter the fascist threat and make sure that the rest of the industrial world joins us in socialist revolution. The sooner the better. Meanwhile, Stalin and Bukharin are arguing for a longer NEP. Trotsky wants to end NEP. Bukharin and Stalin in the mid-1920s are saying that let's let NEP run its full course. Bukharin even suggests that if we prolong NEP, the state can generate sufficient capital through agricultural development that we can essentially build socialism by harnessing market forces, which is a theoretically radical kind of idea. But the implication of that argument is that Contrary to Trotsky's position, the Soviet Union can build socialism on its own without international revolution having to first break out elsewhere around the globe. Stalin agrees. Stalin refers to this as socialism in one country. And he basically puts forward this theory that says Comrade Trotsky and others think that the Soviet Union is weak, that the Soviet Union cannot survive if the rest of the world does not join us in proletarian socialist revolution. We know that revolution to be inevitable, as Comrade Marx predicted back in the 19th century. But we shouldn't count out the Russian people. We shouldn't count out the Soviet people. So Stalin is making this sort of argument about self-reliance. And it appeals to many within the party. Russia can go it alone. Russia can stick it out. Russia can defend herself against fascists and capitalists and imperialists, just as Russia had during the Civil War. And anyone who disagrees, anyone who thinks that Soviet Russia will fail, as Comrade Trotsky is suggesting, does not have faith in the October Revolution, no faith in Comrade Lenin, no faith in the grand progress of historical development outlined by Marx and Engels. At this point, Trotsky cannot believe what he's hearing. He says, no one is saying that Soviet Russia cannot go its own way. Of course, Soviet Russia can stand up in the short term to fascism, imperialism, and the forces of capitalism. But we have known all along, Trotsky says, we have known all along that global revolution is not only desirable, but inevitable. So we have got to speed things up. We've got to see a revolution in Germany. We've got to see a revolution in what we would now call the Third World, right? We've got to see a revolution in the colonial dominions of British India. We've got to see a revolution in China, for instance. And when the world stands alongside us, then we will be able to make that leap forward into socialism. So Trotsky on the one hand, Stalin and Bukharin on the other are putting forward very different ideas about how we're going to get to our ultimate goal of the communist utopia. For Trotsky, the answer is simple. Foment world revolution, bring NEP to an end, and squeeze the peasantry in order to fulfill the teachings of Comrade Lenin. I'll come back to that point later because that has to do with collectivization. For Bukharin and Stalin, the answer is equally simple: a longer, slower NEP, right? Socialism in one country, and potential collaboration or cooperation, I should say, with the. Let me pause this for. Okay, I'm back. I wanted to go back and just address that point about the peasants and collectivization. Just hold off on it for now because we're going to talk more about it next time. But I don't know how to go back and tape over part of this, so apologies. Just bear with me, if you will. But I just wanted to highlight again those 2 points of difference, policy difference between Trotsky and the united opposition versus Stalin and Bukharin. It has to do with the duration of NEP, and it has to do with the question of socialism in one country, as advocated by Stalin, or the theory of permanent revolution, as put forward by Trotsky. We're getting a little bit into the theoretical weeds here of 1920s Marxism-Leninism, so don't worry too much about that. But I realized that the point I was trying to make was a bit obscure, so I just wanted to get back to that and clarify that as we move forward. Okay, so the last point I want to make here too is that one of the arenas in which the faction struggles were waged was the visual. Stalin and his associates from 1925, 1926 forward begin to falsify the narrative of the October Revolution. And they come to eclipse Trotsky's pivotal role in those events. They distort, they minimize Trotsky's contributions to the October Revolution, while simultaneously overblowing Stalin's own role in October, which, as we've seen, was minimal at best. A few weeks ago, we read excerpts from the short course, the short official history of party history commissioned by the party itself, and you saw how the events of 1917, in that case the February Revolution, were spun in such a way as to exalt Stalin and company and minimize Trotsky and others. This is a classic example of how that was done. Another case in point, 1927, the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein is preparing the final cut of his film October to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the October Revolution. He receives orders from the state cinema office that all scenes with Trotsky, or an actor playing Trotsky rather, are to be left on the cutting room floor. So Trotsky is literally snipped out of the party's official filmic, cinematographic history of the revolution as well. So this is a great example of how the historical record could be falsified, how memory itself could be altered. What you see here is a photograph showing Lenin addressing crowds on Red Square, May Day, 1918. Lenin, cap in hand, is about to speak, or is speaking. Trotsky and Kamenev are standing beside him, listening, waiting for their turn. In the doctored version, which was printed in the 1920s and thereafter, Lenin is still there, but Trotsky and Kamenev have been snipped out. So the commissars are made to vanish. Here you see another example of this. Lenin and Trotsky side by side. Thanks to Stalin's influence, Trotsky is airbrushed out of history, airbrushed out of the photograph, airbrushed out of the historical narrative. Trotsky would later refer to this as the Stalinist falsification of history. And just as you white out Trotsky, you white in Stalin and Lenin, so that photos of Stalin sidling up to Lenin, photos that show the close personal friendship of these two men. They were not close personal friends. They were political allies, but they were not close personal friends. Lenin had no close personal friends. But these photos were reproduced en masse again and again to demonstrate and make visible just how intimate and just how special the relationship was between Lenin and the most faithful Leninist of them all, Comrade Stalin. Some of these photos were retouched numerous times so that Stalin was inched ever closer to Lenin. In November of 1927, 10 years after the October Revolution, Trotsky is expelled from the Communist Party. Zinoviev and Kamenev are expelled as well, but they come crawling back. They recant, they retract their criticism of Stalin. They are readmitted to the party and given some very minor token positions. But Trotsky refuses to recant. He's sent off into exile. He's banished from the Soviet Union. He makes his way to Mexico City. Here you see Trotsky posing with the Mexican artist Diego Rivera on the left. And while Trotsky is abroad, expelled from his homeland at Stalin's orders throughout the 1930s, Trotsky is continuing to publish, continuing to write books and articles that are sharply critical of Stalin himself and of the Stalinist state. Stalin has betrayed the revolution. Stalin has corrupted Leninism and turned it into Stalinism. All of this is too much for Stalin himself to take. And so in 1940, a communist agent operating under instructions from Moscow at Stalin's orders murders Trotsky with an axe to the back of his head at his home in Mexico City. The faction struggles are over. So, as I mentioned, the faction struggles have largely been interpreted as struggles driven first and foremost by personality conflict. Stalin hates Trotsky, Trotsky hates Stalin, nobody likes Zinoviev. There's no doubt that deep-seated enmities, rivalries, play a role in this. But we have to think also about the role of policy. We also have to think about how is it that Stalin, of all people, is able to wind up on top? Well, Stalin winds up on top because he is not a gray blur. He is not the outstanding mediocrity of our party. Stalin is a consummate political animal. And Stalin emerges victorious over men who may be smarter than him, Trotsky, men who may give a better speech than him, Zinoviev, men who are better loved, perhaps, than him, in the case, ultimately, of Bukharin. But Stalin is a better example of the political species than any of his rivals. And he bests them at every turn. Trotsky doesn't want to get his hands dirty with paperwork. Stalin revels in it. And it's thanks to paperwork that Stalin is able to pack the hall in 1927 and get the requisite number of votes on the Central Committee to approve of Trotsky's expulsion from the party. Stalin is also able to master the political rhetoric of the mid-1920s. Think back to our discussion of 1917. If part of Lenin's success in October is being able to control the narrative and stress the importance of land, bread, and peace, to sell that message at every opportunity, part of Stalin's success in the mid-1920s is that he is able, through the manipulation of visual evidence, through control over state media, through control over the cinema, through control over official histories of the revolution, Stalin is able to control the narrative in such a way that he presents himself as the best, most loyal, most faithful, most devoted disciple of Lenin, while everybody else has betrayed him. This is a Stalinist cartoon from the mid-1920s, and it shows Bukharin, Rykov, and a bunch of kulaks and priests going down a rickety path labeled the oppositional path, while Stalin stands on the path of Lenin. Going down the path of opposition will lead to rack and ruin. Only standing firmly on the path of Lenin can security, stability, and ultimately victory be achieved. So I think as we think about Stalin and the Stalin system, the Stalin revolution that he helps to uh, spearhead and create, which we'll talk about in the days to come, it's important to take Stalin seriously, and certainly to take him more seriously than his opponents in the 1920s did. They underestimated him, to put it mildly, and the vast majority of those who did so would pay for that mistake with their lives during the great purges of the 1930s. Um, so Stalin is the master politician, um, and he is able to remain the last man standing even after more glittering, uh, fancier, maybe even um, um, more attractive rivals for Lenin's role are defeated, and Stalin emerges victorious. So I'm going to stop there. I want us to think about um, the role of policy in all of this. We'll talk about the end of NEP next time and how Stalin leads uh, the Soviet Union onto a new economic course, one of rapid industrialization and one of agricultural collectivization, both of which will bring the NEP interlude to a screeching halt. And that'll be our subject for next time. So thanks, and I will see you later.